Good afternoon, everyone, and today will be the final of our Chol HaMoed lectures. And today's topic is something that is near and dear to my heart because of my own background and education and whatnot, as I will elaborate. And so I spent a number of my formative years growing up in the upper Manhattan neighborhood of Washington Heights in New York City. And for those of you who are familiar, that is an area that had been established to a large degree by German refugees, Orthodox refugees that had come from Frankfurt and other German cities and towns, and had reestablished their, let's call it lifestyle or way of doing things under the leadership of Rav Breuer. And as a result, they were able to, in many ways, I guess you would say, hold on to traditions that perhaps in other places you don't see as strongly maintained. I often joke, that in Europe, different people lived in their own host societies for so many years, depending on where you lived, depending on how much continuity you had. In some places, you were able to live there for centuries. Unfortunately, we all know that Jewish history, especially in Europe, was a checkered history. It had a lot of ups and downs. More downs in many ways than ups, although the Jewish people are resilient, and we have found ways by which to succeed and to thrive despite the many, many challenges that have been presented to us. But we also know that one of the realities of living life in Europe was relocation. And so if you follow the bouncing ball, so to speak, of Jewish life in Europe, you know that the Jews started largely in Western Europe. Most of the Jews in the time of the Rishon, in the time of Rashi, for example, lived in France and in Germany. And there were Jews right across the border who were the Sephardic Jews living in Spain and again in Portugal and Iberian Peninsula. You also had Jews in Northern Africa and other places of the world. But the Ashkenazic Jews, most of them, as they had been forced out of either whole countries or regions in Western Europe, were forced to relocate, and you saw that in Spain too, but the Jews of Europe were forced to relocate further inward, or inland, so to speak, and therefore you have a lot of Jews in Central Europe and much in Eastern Europe. And by the time that World War II began, most of European Jewry was living in what we call Eastern Europe, the countries of Poland and Russia, and the Baltic states and other countries in that general vicinity, many fewer Jews living in Western Europe. Nonetheless, the country of Germany has always been an important place, at least until recent history, for Jewish development, for Jewish society. And the topic that we're going to focus on, since we're going to piggyback a little bit on yesterday's talk, which was a talk about leadership, and I referenced today's talk yesterday very briefly as we were discussing Moshe Rabbeinu and his role as a Jewish leader, is German Jewry in the middle of the 19th century. And we're going to focus specifically on the personality of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. So Rabbi Hirsch, for me, is a hero to a degree, to a large degree. And I would say that, oftentimes if you're raised, for example, in a Hasidic environment, your Rebbe can oftentimes be viewed as a hero, somebody who people revere, somebody who people look up to, they study his teachings. He becomes in many ways a focal point for the way that you intake, for the way that you perceive, for the way that you digest your Judaism. And for those who have moved on to the state of Israel, I know that we have some present company that spend meaningful time in the land of Israel. There are certain rabbis who developed to a large degree the Jewish community in Israel and helped to frame the way that those Jews think about their Judaism and think about life in the land of Israel. People like Rav Kook, for example, who were very instrumental early on in developing the Jewish Yishuv, the recent, most modern, so to speak, Jewish Yishuv in the land of Israel, and therefore their rulings and their teachings. Others, the Vilna Gaon, for example, you have to go back a little bit further, but his students that came, and the students of many of the great early Hasidic leaders that came to the land of Israel and established customs and established values and things like that. So you often hear about Minhag America or Minhag Eretz Yisrael. Today's day and age is a little bit different because unfortunately, the way that so many people came to America was as refugees. Or even as not in the traumatic form of refugees, but as immigrants who were looking to establish a better life. Many of them, especially those who were coming from Eastern Europe, which made up the majority of what we might call the second immigration wave. There was an earlier immigration wave of Jews and others who came from Western and Central Europe, 1840 roughly to 1880 or thereabouts. That was a smaller population, but they were really the building blocks. There had been a Jewish community existent all the way back to the time of New Amsterdam, to the time of Peter Stuyvesant, who was a great anti-Semite, and one out of a Sephardic community, small. We've been here for about 350 years in the United States, and they established Sheretz Israel, which is the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, now on the west side of Manhattan, and other foundational blocks, so to speak. But more Jews arrived from Western Europe, and they became some of the most popular and wealthy and influential Jews in the 19th century into the 20th century. And then you had a much larger group of Jews that came from Eastern Europe, from Poland, but primarily from Russia. And they were fleeing the persecution and the hardships of the Tsar. And so many pogroms and various challenges that existed at that particular time. And so we've come in stages, we've come in waves, and we found an interesting way to sort of reestablish ourselves here in America. But the concept of Minhag America, though it's been talked about, and in Reform Judaism in particular, such an idea was presented. We're going to come back to Reform soon, because it really is very central to our story as we go back to Germany in the middle of the 19th century. But Minhag America, as far as I can tell, never really established itself as an identity per se. Most people have held on to the Minhagim, the customs that they have brought with them from the Alterheim, from the old world, from the way that they had lived growing up. The closest thing that I have found to this bringing together, if you will, of the various Jews coming from different areas of the world, there is an element of a melting pot, but I often call it Minhag Art Scroll. Because Art Scroll has been sort of a unifying force. Everybody seems to have an Art Scroll sitter, other books from Art Scroll, and that has kind of defined customs and things like that. Whether you do say the putim that are printed in the sitter, or you don't say the putim printed in the sitter, little nuances like that might be subtle and different, but generally speaking, those printing tools, if you will, that we have, those products of Art Scroll and others have really kind of framed the way that we daven and the way that we act in certain ways. But minhag and of course custom and practice, all of these are extremely important. And so when we talk about the hero of today's conversation, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, it's important for us to know a little bit of historical context. It's important for us to know a little bit about what Judaism always was, let's call it historically, and what it then became. Okay, so most of you, if not everybody in the room, are familiar with the three largest groups, let's say within American Jewry. We know that there's Orthodox, we know that there's Conservative, and we know that there's Reform. There are others as well. There's Reconstructionist, and there are people who are unaffiliated completely, et cetera, et cetera. And the numbers, by the way, are very scary. Not our conversation for today, but if you look at the demographics, if you study the present realities, we all know that the only group that is growing proportionately, probably even growing at all in any sustainable way, is the Orthodox element of the Jewish community. Every other segment of Judaism, because of low birth rate and high rates of assimilation, primarily because of the latter, are really on a one-way direction towards not such a great outcome, at least numerically and other ways. And so this is a dynamic that we've seen history play out and certainly makes us feel that we're doing the right thing, at least in terms of adhering to our observance and whatnot. But conservative is an American phenomenon. And so we're going to leave conservative sort of off to the side. Just so you know historically how it developed, Orthodoxy is tried and true. That's where it all began. Now, there have been those historically that have challenged what we might call Torah tradition, the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu. The most famous groups that I'm thinking of are the Sadducees, otherwise known as the Tzaddukim. They were prevalent in the period of the second Beis HaMikdash. They were the students of Tzadok and Baisus, and their Rebbe was the famous Antigonus Ish Socha. And Antigonus Ish Socha was a student of Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik, you're probably familiar with, was the great Kohen Gadol. The Talmud tells us that he was the person who was very involved in sustaining or preserving the Jewish way of behaving, let's call it, at the time of Alexander the Great. He had a student by the name of Antigonus Ishtocho, who had 4 students that we know of. 2 of them were great rabbis named Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yochanan. We find them in Pirkei Avot, that they were the ones who received from Antigonus, and they had students that came after them, 5 sets, 2 each, and the last set was Hillel and Shammai, the most famous of the 5. And then he had 2 other students, and these students were what I guess we would call deviant, or people who misconstrued their Rebbe's teaching. Because he's famous for saying, don't live like a servant who serves his master in order to receive reward, but you should serve your master not for the purpose of receiving reward. Now, most of us interpret that very simply to mean that we should not be motivated for the reward that we're going to get, but we should be motivated for the fact that God tells us to do something, and we should do it because it's the right thing to do. But they interpreted it along with the Greek Hellenistic thinking of the time that there really was no such thing as reward and punishment. There was no such thing as an afterlife in which we will ultimately be rewarded or ultimately punished, God forbid, for our behaviors. And as a result, they were locking into the philosophy more or less of, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you will die. And so live a life of enjoyment today because there is no tomorrow. Enjoy the present, live in the moment. All this kind of philosophy. So the Tzedukkim, in order to get there, they needed to reject certain core fundamental Jewish principles. The most important and famous for our purposes is the rejection of Torah Shebaal Peh, the rejection of the oral law. And so they rejected the idea that the rabbis really had any role, any meaningful, appropriate role in the context of interpreting what the Torah has to say, as well as in transmitting that tradition and being an unmutable tradition. That it can't be changed, it can't be modified. Of course, it can be adjusted for the purpose of particular time and place, but that its foundational principles and what the Torah is actually telling us, those can't be reinterpreted for our personal convenience, let's just say. So you have a group like them, a similar group that came afterwards in the time of the Rambam, called the Karaites, the Karaim. They start in the period of the Gaonim, and Rambam encountered them in large numbers in his city of modern-day Cairo, in the land of Egypt, where he lived. And he spent a lot of his time dealing with the Karaim and rejecting their values and beliefs. And before him, Rabbeinu Sadia Gaon and others. So there have been groups in our history that have not embraced, let's call it, the Torah values, the complete package of Torah values that one would typically expect as far as the tradition for Moshe Rabbeinu. More recently, we have 2 groups. One of them is Reform, and another one is the Maskilim, the Haskalah, which is the Enlightenment. They were more prevalent in Eastern Europe. We're going to have to leave them for another date and time. Maybe next year on Passover we'll get to them. But for this year, we're going to have to stay in the context of Rabbi Hirsch and Germany of the 19th century. And so Reform, which is really the brainchild of Moses Mendelssohn and his, let's call it, spiritual heirs, was an idea that Judaism had grown somewhat stale and outdated. And in order to live a contemporary life, in order to be relevant, in order to be productive in modern society, and society was modernizing. This was on the back end of the Middle Ages. This was at the time of the Renaissance, at the time of the Reformation. Really, reform is not a Jewish concept first and foremost. It begins with the church. The church was where the Reformation really started, with Martin Luther and with others that were making wholesale changes to Catholicism and introducing a whole different brand, if you will, of Christianity, which we typically refer to as Protestant, Protestants, as in Protestant, it's not an ism, I don't think. But either way, that notion of moving away from some of the core values that the church had always maintained and introducing some modern concepts and modern values actually began outside of Judaism. But it was something that was considered to be very, how shall I say, appealing to the Jewish community as well, in part because these Jews saw themselves as needing a way into broader society. They saw that there were opportunities, and I think those opportunities really started to present themselves with the rise of Napoleon. And Napoleon, who had made his way through Western Europe and into Eastern Europe as well, actually to Israel, Palestine at the time, whatever it was called, he was not just a great military leader, but he was also a champion of new rights. But he wanted those new rights to sort of fit in. You might be familiar with the story of the Sanhedrin that Napoleon formed in France in order to deal with certain foundational questions where Judaism seemed to be at odds with Christianity or odds with the Gentile community as a whole. And there was a particular rabbi, together with a number of others, that were tasked to respond to these issues. And it was a very challenging time because, questions of basic faith and whatnot were being put in a very public limelight in the hands of an individual who, of course, was very powerful. And the Jews were not quite sure exactly what to do and how best to respond in order to satisfy his, let's call it curiosity, or maybe more than curiosity, but at the same time to not divulge too much and expose things that would ultimately come back to harm them. So either way, it was a time of shifting winds for the Jewish community. They saw it as an opportunity to get out of the ghetto, an opportunity to get into mainstream life, to become better educated, to have a voice in government, to have opportunities in professional careers that Jews typically had not had access to. And so as a result of all of that, you can imagine, when the floodgates open a little bit, all of a sudden we want to take advantage of all the beauty and all of the good that the world around us has to offer. But we also know that it's a double-edged sword. We have lost more Jews, as we talked about earlier with the issues of assimilation. We've lost more Jews historically, if not in raw numbers, then at least proportionately. We've lost more of them in times of tolerance than we have in times of persecution. Persecution can be a very difficult thing. We all know numerous examples of Jews losing their lives in large numbers, whether it's the Crusades, Chilmonekis, pogroms, other types of pogroms, and of course the Holocaust is the greatest of all of those types of events. But we also know that we've lost Jews to active, not just active practice, but basic Jewish identity because of the openness of certain societies in which we found ourselves, including the United States of America. And while we love America, and while America has been extremely good to the Jews, no other nation in the history of the world can claim the same degree of, I would say, acceptance and openness and protection of the Jewish, despite the challenges we've had some bumps along the way. Not to get into the specifics right now, but America has generally been an extremely warm and receptive place for us, and we all appreciate that. At the same time, we also know what happens when we have too much opportunity and we forget what we're really about and who we truly are, and what makes the Jews unique and special, and what has allowed us to preserve our identity. It has never been our ability to establish ourselves as the leaders in the sciences. It's never been our ability to establish ourselves as the leaders of the arts or the leaders of other areas. It's always been our commitment to Torah that has always held us most in greatest stead. It's always been the foundational block. It doesn't mean other areas aren't important and can't be established, but you have to have your core identity. And identity is not something that happens without having the practice, without having the learning that really establishes who you are. And that, in a sense, is what Rabbi Hirsch was all about. So he is born into, yesterday I mentioned that when it comes to leadership, it's oftentimes a combination of the individual and the circumstance. And when you think about leadership, you're talking about who are the people that have the capacity for greatness, and where do they have the ability to make that greatness felt? And in what context are they able to sort of assert themselves into that context in order to be a difference maker? And so Rav Hirsch, we often think of our leaders, I'd like to think of them as, divinely sent, so to speak, meaning to say that they really were there, God sends for us individuals who have the capacity to be difference makers. And this person walked into a situation in Germany that had been developing already for decades as an area where Orthodoxy was on the decline. And he became now this Renaissance man, but not in the conventional way of understanding it, but from a Torah perspective. In many respects, you could say he redefined what it meant to be a rabbi, but not to redefine it in a Reform sense of the term, but to redefine what Orthodox rabbinate could look like in a way that brought in perhaps some of the modernity, that integrated some of the aspects that were relevant to modern day society, but to do it in a way where the foundation was unwavering, where the foundation was solid, where Torah was always the driving force behind everything that he did. He just needed to figure out how to contextualize it and how to frame it in a way where the modern day listener could hear it, could understand it, could accept it. You know, I didn't grow up under the leadership of Rav Breuer in the community of Washington Heights, which I mentioned before. The Rav at the time when I was growing up was Rav Shimon Schwab, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. They say about Rav Breuer, though, that when he first came to America, in fact, I think for his entire life, so long as he was the acting rabbi of the shul, he spoke in German, because that was his mother tongue, and that was actually the mother tongue of most of his congregants. But as you can imagine, that didn't do so much for the younger generation. For people that were growing up in America, they needed somebody who could speak their language. They needed somebody who could speak to them. And so the wisdom of bringing Rav Schwab in, even though he was German-born as well, but he spoke a fluent English, and he was able to connect to that next generation. That's an example of where you see trying to bring the leadership to the people in a way that they can be led, in a way that they ultimately can be inspired and can be, the transmission of the tradition can continue. So in effect, Reform was challenging every aspect of Jewish life, doing away with a lot of the practice, changing the focus. No longer was there this idea that Zion was the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal became Germany. And so Berlin replaces Jerusalem as the focus of our prayers, as the focus of our ideals and our dreams. It's interesting today, really not our conversation, but that you see today that Zionism does play a very prominent role in Reform Judaism today. Meaning to say, if you look at the core values of what Reform is about, Israel is there. But it wasn't always that way. For a long part of Reform's history, Israel was not the goal. The Beit HaMikdash was not the end goal. There was no desire to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. That's why the Reform place of worship is called a temple. Have you ever noticed that? The Reform places, they don't call it a congregation. Congregation, I think, is sort of a mixed term. You see it with conservative, you also see it with Orthodox. But temple, I know, for example, in Chicago, there's Temple Menorah, there's Temple this, Temple that, Temple Bethel, or others. These temples, the word comes from the idea that they are, in effect, rooting out this notion of rebuilding the Jerusalem temple, and they're going to replace it with their own temple. Meaning to say that there is no ultimate aspiration beyond living in the moment and trying to be, how shall I say, a positive citizen that happens to be of, quote unquote, forgive me, Mosaic descent. That's also a Reform concept, right? That we have Mosaic traditions. Typically you think of Mosaic as like some beautiful artwork. You know, like a beautiful wall that's made up of little pieces of tile and things like that. We call that a mosaic. But the word mosaic also comes from the idea that they trace back to Moses. So they say, you know, the old question, are you an American Jew or are you a Jewish American? Right? Now let's leave political correctness aside. I hate some of that stuff because it's so confusing. You know, all these different terms of whatnot. But to be an American Jew means that your Judaism is your core identity, but you live in America. And of course it doesn't mean that you're going to be disloyal to America. You love America and it's been so good to you, as we talked about. But you're a Jew who happens to be American. You could be a Canadian Jew, an Italian Jew, or whatever Jew, an Israeli Jew, right? All of those are possible. On the other end, if you're a Jewish American, what you're saying is that first and foremost your allegiance is to your local country. A Jewish German. Okay? There were phrases out there of being more German than the Germans. And though I never experienced it firsthand, any study of the pre-war society, especially in Western Europe, where Jews were given the opportunity to really demonstrate their loyalties, to really grow into those societies, you see that many Jews really wanted to make that identity paramount to who they were. Heinrich Heine, who was considered one of the great poets of German life, especially in the 19th century, he's quoted as saying that, and he converted. So his baptism was a passport to European civilization. He felt he could never make it as a Jew in Western Europe unless he became an actual Christian. Not every Jew went to that degree, but to whatever degree you went, you're talking in effect about understanding that your Judaism was an encumbrance. Your Judaism was an obstacle. It was something you had to deal with. In America, you typically don't. Of course, there's anti-Semitism, but you don't typically have to deal with your Judaism, especially not today. I know when I was growing up, my father did not wear his kippah at work. You know, he had a whole question with his Rav, should he wear his yarmulke, should he not wear his yarmulke? For years, many doctors did not wear a yarmulke at the hospitals and certain other places because it was considered to be not healthy for their careers. I'm not going to get into the halachic implications of that. But nowadays, it's very different. At least in areas where there are large Jewish populations, it's basically, the hospitals can get themselves in a lot of trouble if they tell somebody to take off their yarmulke as a doctor or as anything else, right? Because nowadays, freedom of religious expression, so long as it's within certain guidelines, is completely acceptable. Bear with me if you don't want for just a second, then I'll cycle back. So therefore, this was the Germany in which Rabbi Hirsch was born. He was born into a society where the old-fashioned, so to speak, traditional Judaism was on its way out. It was dwindling in number. It was considered outdated, which, by the way, was true here in America also. If I could bring everybody in a time capsule to America in the early 1950s, I'm sure most of you, if you were living then, if you could remember to that period of time, know that Orthodoxy was certainly not the rage. It was certainly not the place to be. Right? Day schools were very few. Right? Most Orthodox, whatever Orthodox meant, kids were in public school and attending Hebrew school after school, Sunday mornings, whatever it might be. That was not the norm. You know, when you talk about, like, for example, in certain cities, the first day schools, some in Brooklyn already started in the late 19th century, early 20th century, but most of them started to pop up in the 50s and 60s. That's when you really started to see Orthodox day schools beginning to exist, but they were definitely the minority. And most people belonged to conservative and Reform congregations. Conservative was very, very big at that time. And the trends, if anyone would have looked at it with your normal prognosticating capacity, you would have said Orthodoxy is basically dead, and the other Judaisms are the way to go, because they have all the vibrance, they're integrating American life and all of this, modernity, and Orthodoxy can never survive. And we see, interestingly, how the exact opposite has occurred over the last many decades.
Just was reading that new head of the United States Air Force named David Goldstein. And
is he Jewish?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, the name sounds Jewish.
Yeah, but he is Jewish.
Halachically Jewish.
Halachically
Okay,
Jewish.
good.
The United States Air Force. Who would have ever imagined?
Oh yeah, right.
First, I was
Right.
just amazed.
Right. Yeah. The Jews have made their way to all sorts of places in the United States and elsewhere. And the question, of course, is how much do you hold on to your own tradition? So prayers were shifted out of Hebrew into German, right? The prayer book started to be, people were reciting their prayers in German, and people started to move away from kashrut, from keeping kosher. All the kind of staples, the basic foundational pieces that one would typically associate with Judaism at home and in the synagogue were moved. You started to see the beginning, for example, of the introduction of the choir, which was a Christian thing. It didn't exist in shuls until relative recent Jewish history. The rabbis started to wear clerical robes. So instead of looking like a rabbi might look, whatever that means to you, started to look like a priest might look, and deliver the sermon in the current vernacular, which in this case was German. And it's interesting, you still see some of that. You still see, I know my grandfather, Zalzai Gesund, is 102, a Holocaust survivor, lives in Montreal. He doesn't really make it to shul that much anymore, but for a long time he davened in a shul at Côte St. Luc, which is in suburban Montreal. And the chazan every Shabbos would get into this whole getup. He'd wear the long, robe of sorts and put on, the special hat with the little pom-pom, and that's the big pom-pom on the top, and that would be his way that he would step to the bima, and it was an Orthodox service. It was an Orthodox shul, but that was sort of, the trappings. And growing up in Washington Heights, they actually had that. We had a choir. Now it was an all-male choir, which may not sound like such a big deal, but in Reform, it's interesting because there's Reform in Germany, and then there's Reform in America. And Reform in America, which really got its roots in the South, in Charleston, South Carolina, and eventually in the Northeast, in Philadelphia, and New York, and other places, the reformers in America took reform to a whole new level. They introduced certain things that you didn't even find in Germany, like the mixed pew, for example, where men and women were sitting together. That, I think, began here in the United States, and the mixed choirs and things like this. So we had a choir in Washington Heights because they integrated a choir into the shul in Frankfurt. And Rav Hirsch, when he became rabbi, we're sort of getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but that's okay. He also dressed in that type of garb that we described before, in part because he wanted to sort of bring the circle back. He wanted to show that orthodoxy could be current, could be relevant to what was considered to be the appropriate practice, the appropriate way that you worship in a very dignified German society, in German community, right? Shul, anyone who's ever davened in Breuer's knows, it looks very different from your average shtibel in Borough Park. And it looks very different even than, let's say, your average Pesach program at the Marco Polo or anywhere else. It is a very dignified, and I'm not trying to be in any way disparaging of any other type of davening. Very dignified, sometimes almost to a fault. Sometimes when people who are not used to it come into it, they say, oh my goodness, too many rules. And there's a rule basically for everything, and there's a tune basically for everything. And the Baruch Hu changes based on what's coming up in the davening and all this, a tremendous amount that you really need to know if you're going to be a carrier of that tradition. But a lot of that was in response to what was going on in the society around you. A lot of it was this idea that we needed to make orthodoxy, at least from a packaging. You know, life is all about marketing. Some of the greatest movements in world history have all been the outgrowth of marketing, right? We know, for example, how did Christianity really get out there? It got out there mainly from one person by the name of Paul. And Paul, in essence, I'm really going to distill it to its core, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but he basically took away the hardest aspects of Judaism and kept all the good stuff. So he maintained this idea of a single God. He maintained this idea of, let's call it a tradition, but he removed most of the actions that we had to do, the commandments, the painful ones, in particular the Sabbath, which of course can feel constricting for certain people, circumcision, things like that, and it became mostly a faith-based religion. And he held on to the idea of a world to come, but it didn't require the same level of investment that Judaism demands of its adherents. And so he was preaching to a largely pagan civilization in the Roman Empire as he made his way through the Mediterranean basin, going from community to community, and he was giving them an opportunity to know that their lives mattered, to know that there was a divine being that cared about them, to know that there would be an afterlife where their lives wouldn't just end, which was the Greek tradition, right? The idea that you live your life in this world, that there is no afterlife, there is nothing beyond the reality that we can see and touch and feel. And so that was a very appealing idea because it gave people this concept that we're part of something bigger and greater and that my life matters. On the other hand, it didn't make it all that difficult. So if I give you the world and I don't charge you a lot for it, I'm a pretty good salesman. You're probably going to want to buy my product. And so sales are really important. And the way that we package things can make a big difference. So one of the greatest assets, we're not going to get to everything about Rav Hirsch in the time that we have left, but one of the greatest things about him was his ability to remain steadfast in what Judaism and what Torah demanded of us, and yet find a way to make it feel and look and sound contemporary so that you didn't feel like you were part of an outdated tradition that was, nobody wants to be on the wrong side. We all want to be with the winner. And social pressure can be extremely powerful. I'm going to digress for a second because I think you'd appreciate this. There was some research done, and I think it was back in the 1960s. I think the professor his last name was Asch, A-S-C-H. And he presented to a number of college-age students. Perhaps I have some of the details off a little bit, but the basic idea is correct. And he presented to them 2 lines on a piece of paper, on a board, whatever it was, and one line is clearly longer than the other. 20 of the 25 people in the room were paid. They knew what the research was all about. They were actors. There were a few that had no idea what was going on. And these 5 innocent souls walk into the room, and they are asked the question that everybody else has asked, which one is longer, which one is shorter, and all the people that were paid were saying that the shorter one was longer, and that the longer one was shorter. And so through a series of acts of social pressure, eventually, I think maybe one or two still maintained the accuracy of what they started with, maybe one, out of the 5 people. And we're not talking about a nebulous concept. We're talking about 2 lines on a piece of paper, which one is longer, which one is shorter. Because when social pressure is very strong, and we've seen it all throughout society, all throughout history, not everybody believed in, let's just use the German example, what the Nazis were selling. Not everybody ascribed to their violence, ascribed to their tactics, ascribed to even their economic plan and other aspects of their plan. But they used brute force, and they used very, very powerful techniques, and eventually, even if they didn't get the deep adherence of everybody, no one wanted to be on the wrong side, especially if they feared their lives, which most people did. And so this Rav Hirsch, he's a very well-educated Jew. He lives in a time where he really becomes sort of the Renaissance man, as we mentioned before, for Orthodox rabbinate, because people saw him as being relevant. He could quote the great philosophers. He could reference the arts. He's somebody who lived in their world. And at the same time, he was very, very relevant to Torah as well. And his impact of establishing a clearly defined, independent Orthodox community, at times where the Orthodox community was threatened to be integrated in the broader Jewish community, also significantly helped him and helped the people in his community retain their identity and to thrive. And he produced a congregation very diverse: bankers, professors, physicians, artists, scientists, all of them maintaining a core philosophy that you may have heard of, and that philosophy is called Torah im Derech Eretz. Torah im Derech Eretz means that Torah is your foundation, and you also have the Derech Eretz. The Derech Eretz is considered to be your integration in the world around you. And the two of them go together. And one is not, let's call it b'diavad. There is a philosophy out there. I'm not here to judge it. There is a philosophy that basically says that really we're supposed to be in a life of what we might call Torah only. But nebuch, we have to engage in the world because you have to make a parnasa, because you have to do other things. But Torah is really considered to be your locus and your center, if you will, of your life. And Rav Hirsch had that idea, but he maintained that the other aspects were not what we call b'diavad, which I'm going to try to translate as not as an unpreferred aspect of one's life, let's call it. But he maintained that understanding science gives you a better appreciation for Torah. Understanding the arts, same type of thing. You can live a more robust life as an observant Jew if you understand more about what the world has to offer. And in many ways, Rambam was very similar. Did you want to ask or say something? Yes. So that's a different piece. I'd rather leave that for now, maybe for a private conversation. But the gentleman in front over here did reference a statement of our rabbis that said Derech Eretz kadma laTorah, which means that engaging in the world in many ways precedes the Torah. And some of it may relate to, for example, imein kemach in Torah. If you don't have flour, if you don't have bread, if you can't live, you can't learn. Right? We know that there is a certain relationship between your ability to make an income and to provide for your family and to be able to learn. You can't typically do one without the other. Now, very briefly about some of Rabbi Hirsch's greatest writings. He wrote in 1837 a book called Chorev. I don't think it's that widely circulated today, although you can get an English translation through Feldheim Publishers, and some incredible ideas that emerged from that. He actually divided all of the Torah into 6, or all the mitzvot, the commandments, into 6 categories. We don't have time to get into all of them right now. A very rational, Germanistic, if you will, approach to Torah, not integrating much as far as the Midrashim are concerned. But one thought that I will share with you from Chorev, because I think it's so beautiful. He said, typically we think of 3 holidays: Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. In reality, there are 4, not including the high holidays. There's Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, and there's also Shmini Atzeres. Shmini Atzeres, which we celebrate in effect as a continuation of Sukkot, is really a separate holiday. It has its own Kiddush, it has its own name, whole different conversation about how it's really different from Sukkot and why it's right up against Sukkot, whereas Shavuos is not right up against Pesach. Is also an interesting conversation that we do not have time for. But he says that Passover, Pesach, represents the physical birth of the Jewish people. Shavuos, which we're now counting towards, represents the spiritual birth of the Jewish people. We're physically born in the Exodus. We became a nation. But a nation without a spiritual identity is not going to last very long. And so we got our spiritual identity at the foot of Har Sinai with the receiving of the Torah. Sukkot, he says, represents the physical survival of the Jewish people. The idea that God is over us, that we live in temporary huts, and we continue to survive through all the generations. That's why I often refer to Sukkot as the unofficial holiday of Jewish history. Because it's really the idea that God has continued to be with us without all the supernatural miracles. But maybe you could argue the greatest miracle of Jewish history is our survival. Not the splitting of the Red Sea, but our survival. And great thinkers and what have said such. Because that's really the essence. If you think about it, we've defied every rule that history has ever presented. And Shmini Atzeres, which is in a way Simchas Torah, represents the spiritual survival of the Jewish people. The idea that we continue, it wasn't just a one and done ceremony at the foot of a mountain, it's become integrated into our very selves, to the point where we complete it every year, and we dance, and we celebrate, and we connect to it very deeply. Because in essence, that's who we are as a people. That's a thought that I wanted to share with you from Choref. He also, of course, wrote the 19 letters of Ben Uziel, which in many ways was the beginning of a lot of the Kiruv literature that you will read today. A dialogue between a rabbi and a young man who's trying to find his way in the world and dealing with a lot of the philosophical questions. And the rabbi responds to it using modern terminology in a way that the young man can receive it, in a way that makes the Torah still relevant to the young man who's trying to find his place in modern German society. And then he wrote commentaries. One on the Tehillim, about which Rav Hirsch was very passionate, and one of the Chumash. You can get the Hirsch on the Chumash, which of course is very, very well known, extremely profound in many ways. And one of the beauties of the way that Rav Hirsch writes is the fact that he's very focused on the etymological roots of the words. He tries to understand not just the shoresh, not just the root of the word, but the letter construct, and how certain letters relate to other letters. So I'll share with you one example, and with this we will close. You may be aware that there are 4 letters in the Hebrew language that if let's say, God forbid, your lips just disappeared, you could not articulate these 4 letters. They're called bumuf, Beis, Vav, Mem, Pei. Try to make a bet with your mouth without your lips. Anyone want to try? All together now? Bum, right? Pa, ma, pa. You need them. Without your lips, you cannot express these. Now, you need your lips to a lesser degree, I think, for all the letters, but they're considered to be the letters from your mouth as opposed to the otiot geronot, like the throat letters, like the het and the ayin and whatnot. Okay. So, therefore, because they are connected from their source of articulation, they're also connected in terms of their meaning. So the word tefillah, which we're about to engage in just a few minutes, of prayer, comes from the shorish palel. And therefore that relates to the word balel, which you might be familiar with. Belulav Hashem, and we talk about the karbanot, the mincha is mixed in oil. And he said that you'd have like a mixture and you'd pour in the oil and it would mix in to a pre-existing batter or mixture. You'd add the oil to it and you would embellish that mixture accordingly. Tefillah, he says, which again has that same etymological root. Tefillah comes from the idea that we have experiences. We have personality. We have history. We have all sorts of things that goes into the construct of who I am. I don't walk into a prayer service as a tabula rasa. I don't walk in with a clean slate as if I'm a nobody. I walk in with my core identity very much part and parcel of the person who's engaging in the prayer. And therefore, tefillah means take your experiences, take your existing personality and all of those things that make you uniquely you, and reflect it now into the prism of your prayer. Own the prayer as a personal expression of your connection to God through the very fact of who you are and what makes you unique and special. And so therefore, as we think about Rav Hirsch, who not only in my mind is a hero of 19th century Germany, but really a hero of Judaism ever since. because so much of what Rav Hirsch stood for, so many of the concepts that he introduced, and in many ways made kosher, have really remained front and center for all Orthodox Jews, even until today. There's so many, if you look a little bit, you can see without much difficulty, so many aspects of what we've kind of brought into American and other Western societies, and even in Israel, the idea of living in the modern world and not living as a, let's call it as a secondary lifestyle, but sort of finding the way that the two of them could support one another, with Torah as the lead, as Torah as the guide, but nonetheless not being looking away from the society in which we live, but trying to find ways with which to integrate the beauty, integrate the knowledge that it offers, and in that way to be a more well-rounded and more accomplished and more fulfilled Jew. A good moment.